Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about how to do a professional grind on a chainsaw chain. And you're probably thinking, oh no, not another chainsaw sharpening video. Well, you'd be correct. Because a lot of people just get it wrong. And on a lot of the chainsaw forums, I've even seen people write and say, oh, I need some help. The right side of my chainsaw grinder is grinding more than the left, or vice versa. In actual fact, I've never ever seen a chainsaw grinder that's going to grind more off one side than the other side. It's operator error, simple as that. You haven't set it up properly. First of all, sometimes it's not entirely your fault. So we'll talk about the chain errors from manufacture, from a brand new chain. And they've got errors. The teeth are different lengths. They're not exactly the same length. The machines stamp out the teeth by the millions. Another machine assembles them all, and another machine, before they're actually assembled, they're sharpened. So they're stamped, the top plate bends over, and a lot of times at the back of the tooth, and I've seen many batches where it's a little bit rough, the surface, it's not exactly dead flat, and that presents a problem with the backstop, meaning that the length of the tooth can have variation if you've got a rough edge on the back where the backstop sits. So first of all, the first one in the chain errors is what we just spoke about, the tooth variation, and that can be up to 0.2 of a millimetre. In probably some cases it could be more. So I've measured a lot of chains and I've found to be between the longest and the shortest. Most of the time they're around about 10 millimetres. So, you know, I could measure 9.8 and the next one could be 10.01 or something like that there. So, yeah. And we spoke about the rear of the tooth can have an uneven finish, causing variation with the tooth. So the backstop must sit at the bottom of the tooth. Normally at the bottom of the tooth, at the back of the tooth, right down the bottom, it's got a nicer finish, because up where the top plate and the side plates meet, it's bent. That's usually the worst. It's got a crease in it. That's usually the most uneven surface. It's not an issue if you're hand filing, but if the backstop is sitting up against it, and on the Stihl USG grinder, I had to modify, I made a new backstop so that it sits right down the bottom on top of the drive link and right behind the back of the tooth. So therefore, it is the optimal setting for a backstop. Even on the cheap grinders, they're normally made out of thin metal and they sit right down the bottom. So it's a little bit different on the USG grinder. So I had to modify it because they must have been thinking that they've got the perfect chain. And I've seen some bad Stihl chains that have got a very rough surface on the back. And if we just put a picture up there of the Oregon, I've got two pictures. So the pictures will show you that you've got a good chain and you've got a bad chain from the manufacturers that have very bad rough surfaces on the back. And that goes with any manufacturer. It could be different batch variation. And if we have another look, there's some more pictures. These ones are from Stihl, and we can put two pictures up there, the good and the bad. So normally that variation could only be 0.1 of a mil or something like that. It's not a huge amount, but nonetheless, it is an error through manufacturing. And I even checked the tooth to the raker just to make sure how accurate that is, and I found variation of at least 0.1 of a millimetre there. So that's the errors that you can get in the chain, and also when the chain is worn, the linkages are all worn and the chain becomes very sloppy and you've got movement. And that's why it's essential that when you do push the tooth, that you make sure that you're pushing the tooth right back into the backstop to take up any slack that's in the worn linkages. So that's the error from the manufacturers. They're only slight errors, but nonetheless, they are still there. In all manufacturing, nothing's perfect, and you've got tolerances. Even the grinders have got tolerances. Between batches, you can find out it could be 1 degree off or something like that there. It brings me to the next point about chainsaw grinder errors. You know, we spoke before about the backstop sitting too high. Well, that was the case on this one here. In the perfect world, it's not an issue, but I found out that it works much better if it sits right down to the bottom, and we can zoom in and have a good look at that later. So that's that one there. The next is the scales. The scale for the top plate and the scale of the top plate cutting angle. So that's the motor that tilts. That's a top plate cutting angle. That's what it's referred to technically. You could find out those scales could be out as much as 2 degrees. That's not going to be a huge issue, and that's not going to really be detrimental. The other thing is that incorrectly, you don't dress the wheel to the correct shape, so therefore you won't get the perfect grind. So that's those little errors there. And we'll get on to the operational errors when you operate the grinder and the errors that you can make. How many times have you heard a tradesman or a person using their tools and they're blaming the tools and saying, oh, yeah, these tools aren't very good, this is rubbish, when in actual fact it's the person using the tool that doesn't know how to use it properly or has never been shown. And this is really is the case with a lot of chainsaw grinders. People are not using them incorrectly. So we'll go over those and we'll talk about those errors. Okay, operational errors. The first one is the wrong angles are selected. So firstly, this top plate angle here. The top plate is, when we view down from the top of the chain, is that horizontal flat plate. Normally you would set this between 25 and 30 degrees. Still don't recommend 25 degrees anymore. They recommend 30. Oregon sometimes recommend 25 degrees. So for the most part, if you stick on 30, you can't make a mistake. The angle that the head sits at, that is referred to the top plate cutting angle. Internationally, virtually on every chain, it's set at 60 degrees. On a Stihl USG grinder, that's 30 degrees. Don't want to confuse you, but what I will say is that Oregon use the vertical position as their 90 degree reference point. So that's 90 degrees at the top. Oregon tilt to the right, as you can see, Stihl tilts to the left. So if this is 90 degrees and we put a 60 degree top plate cutting angle, we will move this into the 60 degree position, which means we've gone from 90 to 60. So we've moved 30 degrees. The Stihl USG uses 0 degrees as their reference point. So we tilt it over 30 degrees. So it's moved 10, 20, 30. Exactly the same thing. It's just the opposite. It's the same as where you feed the teeth in from this side on a Stihl USG grinder. And on an Oregon grinder, you feed it in from the back because the wheel's on that angle. It's on the opposite angle of that. So there's a lot of things that are a little bit different, and it all achieves the same job. So they're the two angles. Don't worry about trying to play with all the other angles unless you get experience. Some of the grinders don't even have an adjustment for the head, or an adjustment for the top plate cutting angle, which is a technical term, but we'll just refer to it as the grinder head. So a lot of the cheaper grinders don't have that option. Wouldn't worry about it because, as I said, internationally, most companies are recommending 60 degrees. This is what you actually get with a file. When the file's held at the right position, which is about 20 to 25% above the top of the tooth, the arc of the file, where it meets the top of the tooth, will give you about a 60 degree angle. That's the optimum angle. So we won't talk about all the other angles because in most cases, the 60 degrees on here or 30 degrees on a Stihl, this is the same whether it's a Stihl or whether it's a Oregon, because the reference point 0 is the same on both machines, whether it's Oregon or Stihl. So the next thing we'll get into about how to set up any grinder and avoid those errors between inconsistent grinds on the left side and inconsistent grinds on the right side, so that you're not turning around and saying, why is my grinder grinding more off the left or the right? So we'll go over that. Okay, so if you have a look at the backstop, I was talking about errors before, and if you have a good look at this backstop here, you'll notice that you can see there's a little bit of a gap up here. So the backstop really gets underneath the tooth down the bottom, and as you can see, if we just sort of like back that off a little bit and move that forwards, you can see how the backstop sits on the drive link and just touches the back, and there's a little tiny gap up the top there because I don't want it touching. Now this is a 3/8 chain, so if we were to put a 3/8 low profile chain on there, the drive link's a bit smaller, but it still works fine. The original backstop was touching more up the top of the tooth rather than the bottom of the tooth. And this is where a lot of the errors are. And if we just have a quick look at another picture there that shows on the steel chain that the back of the chain has got a few sort of errors on there. And if we were to take this chain off, we may be able to actually even see that. See whether you can actually see the back of the chain. It can look, I've seen some really bad ones and I've seen some really good ones. So it's something that, there's the back there, and you can see this uneven, look at this really bad uneven surface here. So you can see why you don't want the backstop touching anywhere up the top here. The lower section is much better. We'll just take another one on the opposite side. There's one there. It's the same thing. You can see up the top that it's in worse condition up the top. I only wanted to show you that because I've got good steel chains that don't have that. And as I said, sometimes it could be a batch variation. So, okay, if you were to watch even the Stihl video or even the Oregon video, and you'll see a guy with a digital caliper, and he'll be telling you to measure your teeth and find your shortest tooth and use that as your master tooth and grind all the tooth the same. And then using the old-fashioned raker gauge, which is a constant depth gauge. So this is the procedure that they tell you. While this works okay, they're trying to make it idiot-proof so that you don't stuff up. But we have progressive depth gauges, which were invented by Ray Carlton back in the late 60s, which progressively adjust the depth from the standard 0.65 of a millimetre. So by the time we get to the end of the life, you've got about 1.2 millimetres raker depth. So yeah, they're different. So use a progressive depth gauge where possible, especially when the chain's worn down. So I'm not going to talk about old worn chain. This is a brand new chain. So let's just pretend that we've used it and it's blunt and we need to sharpen it. Now, because of the backstop is actually in perfect condition to sit right down the bottom of the tooth where there is less, a better surface finish. As I've showed you before, the top of the tooth is a little bit rough, so you can get variations, and you've got variations in the tooth. So the way that I set up any type of grinder is a little bit, well, it's almost probably the same as what you're doing, but I pay more attention to what I'm doing rather than just set it up and rush into it. So an example is if we're going to do this tooth here, and if we stand at the back, and that's how you view the tooth. So if we stand at this side, this is the back, that side, and this side's the front of the tooth. So if we stand at the back of the tooth, this is viewed at the left. So we have to adjust this so it's 30 degrees. Okay, so we'll just, there's 30 degrees there. So that's 30 degrees. And interesting enough, that's on the left side. And if we zoom back out, that's on the left side, and that's on the left tooth. When you view that on an Oregon, it's the opposite. When you adjust this on the left side, it'll be for the right tooth. We can actually show you that. So there's a few things that are really great about a Stihl USG grinder. The left side does the left side, the right side does the right side of the tooth, and it's the opposite for an Oregon. Interesting. So, okay, that's set there. We've actually set the actual grinding head, and that's set at, we have a look over here. We set that, I've got a mark on the side here. This is set up for 60 degrees, but on the Stihl USG, that is got 30 degrees on it. As we spoke before, it's 30 degrees off 90 degrees. Now, the next adjustment that you've got, and you'll be able to see that there, you've got a screw at the side here. So this adjusts how much that it comes down. And it's the same on a lot of grinders. You have that adjustment there. Now, what you need to do here is make sure that you've got that set so that it's not right down into the gullet. It touches the bottom, so we'll bring that down and we'll wind it up and we'll zoom in so that you can see everything. So there's the tooth, and what we're going to do is lower this. Okay, it's touching the tooth and it's pushing down on it. I'm going to adjust the knob. You can see how the wheel just raises up there so that it barely lifts up. So that's going to be my grinding position. I can always adjust it later if we need a little bit more. So that's the grinding position there. Comes down, that's the bottom of the tooth. You can see, you can just see if I push a little bit hard, you can see some movement. The next thing to adjust is the backstop, and that's this little knob that's here, and we move this into the grinding wheel. This is where a lot of people make the mistake. Now, the grinding wheel, we'll talk about that next, is that when you mount the grinding wheel on there, you are supposed to spin it and make sure that it's not running to the left or the right, that it's got no wheel wobble in it. A lot of the grinding wheels can have a little bit of wheel wobble. If you do have a bit of wheel wobble, unloosen the grinding wheel and spin it around in different positions, and you'll find out you should be able to get the optimal position with the least amount of wheel wobble. The actual Stihl wheels are very good. They're better than some of the Oregon grinders, but this is a precision grinder anyway, as good as what you're going to get. And I don't have any issues with any grinding wheels that I've ever put on a Stihl USG grinder. So the next thing is that when you do adjust this, and we'll back it right off, and you'll see that there's a gap. Now, I can spin this wheel. So what you need to do is adjust this knob here so that it just touches. You can hear that? It's touching. We want a little bit more than that, so we'll touch that a bit more. You can see the tooth moving. If you actually have a good look, we'll zoom in there. As I'm rocking that backwards and forwards, you can see that tooth is moving. So I'll lock that in a position. That's going to probably take off between 0.2 and 0.3 of a millimetre. That's going to be our starting position. We're going to grind the whole chain like that, and everything should be fine. So you only want to do a very light grind. So we'll just turn that on. Bring that down nice and slow. Now, the other mistake people make is that they bring this wheel down way too much. These wheels on the Stihl USG are much better than the pink oxide. So you still bring it down nice and slowly, barely touch. Okay, so what I want to do now, that's the first tooth. I just want to take that off and just have a look at the grind. And if you do, you'll find out that you'll see how there's a bit of red there. What I did, probably forgot to mention it, I like to mark the teeth with a little bit of red texture. And that way you can tell that it's grinding everything off. So you can see that it needs just a fraction more. So what we'll do now is just adjust that. And that's going to be our master link. Now you can spend a lot of time mucking around finding your shortest tooth. But on a brand new chain, I tend not to worry about that. It's a brand new chain. I'll just check that again. Still needs a little bit. Now the other thing is, because it's a brand new chain, you might find out also that the profile of the wheel doesn't match the chain. But once you've ground the chain, then it will match perfect. And I can keep my finger on that. So now look at that. That's beautiful. That's ground beautiful. And we've got that nice shape there. Okay. Now, the other thing was, which I wanted to sort of show you, was when you do look at a Stihl USG chart, you'll find out that the side of the vise will have plus and minus 15. And that's referred to offset grinding, but it's not the same as 10 degrees downward tilt, because with the vise adjustment, which is here, this is the, I'll just unloosen the vise here. Okay, so that's the 0 position. I've just loosened that accidentally, so I'll lock that back in. That's the 0 position on the vise, and we'll just see whether, you should be able to see that. I think you can see that now. And if you actually look at it, it goes up to minus 40. There it is, minus 40 to positive 40 there. So this is different. The vise here set up is a little bit different than the Oregon. They're recommending offset grinding, but rather than offset grinding to get 10 degrees downward tilt, you move the tooth away from the grinding wheel. Now on the Oregon, sorry, that's on an Oregon grinder. You move the vise away from the tooth, so the tooth moves away from the grinding wheel. Now, on a Stihl USG grinder, what you actually do is move the vise into the grinding wheel, which is the opposite effect. So I've got that for a left-hand tooth, I've got that on minus 15 degrees. That's the only other parameter that I didn't mention, but I've just mentioned it now. So on a normal Oregon grinder, you won't do that unless it's specified by the manufacturer, because Stihl don't recommend 10 degrees downward tilt. What they're doing is offset grinding, which is totally different. So now, if we were to do another tooth, we'll just sort of go in there like that. We should get a nice, beautiful grind on that. Just make sure you bring the wheel down nice and slow. And if we have a look at that, it should be okay. You should be, that should grind up it's just, look, there's a little bit of texture on that because I marked a few teeth. See whether you can see that. Just a little bit. Look, I'm not really that worried about that because I can feel that tooth. It's razor sharp. I was just marking a few, and that's not a bad idea, that you take a texture and you can mark a few teeth and you can see how your grind is compared to the original grind. You may want to set it up. Remember, at the factory, they can make a couple of degrees error. So that's all I did it for, just to see, for my own peace of mind, was my grind the same as the factory grind or the specifications that they're giving you. But as I said, the factory can make a couple of degrees mistake, but I wouldn't worry about that. So now what you would proceed to do is grind all of that left side. Then you would take the chain off and you will inspect it to make sure that they're all ground pretty good. Just a quick inspection. Now, if you're to put the caliper on there, you'll find out I'm only taking off about 0.3 of a millimetre. I sharpen my chains when they go a little bit blunt. I don't sharpen my chains when they're totally blunt or got a lot of damage on them. Very rarely do I ever get damage on my chains because I'm a little bit careful that the chainsaw chain cuts wood. I don't want to be cutting dirt or rocks. But accidents can happen occasionally, and you might cut through a log and you'll hit the ground and you could damage the tooth, in which case you'll have to take more than 0.3 of a millimetre off. But normally 0.3 of a millimetre is all I generally take off. And if we have a look at a tooth, a 3/8 chain is approximately 10 millimetres in length. And if you go down to the end of the life, the witness mark, you've got about 7 millimetres of tooth. So if you're grinding approximately 0.3 of a millimetre of tooth, you'll get at least 20 sharpenings out of that, provided that you take your time. So when you do the right side, that's just a matter of loosening this plate here and turning this to the right, 30 degrees to the right. Now, the Stihl USG grinder has a fantastic little backstop adjustment where you move this, and we'll get right behind there so that you can see it, and we'll zoom in. It's one of the things that I really love about the Stihl USG grinder that doesn't have it on others. The backstop, it's got a little ball bearing with a spring on it, and you can move it from side to side. On the Oregon type grinders, you've got an adjustment, a wheel that moves it in and out. I actually like it this way because it takes 1 second just to push it. So if we're going to do the right side, we move that to the right side. And there's the right side tooth there because we're viewing it from the back. And that's the right side tooth. Now, it should technically, and we'll bring it down and check, we have to offset the vise. Don't forget to do that, to the positive side. So I need to loosen the vise and bring the vise out to positive 15. Now this is not degrees, the vise is in millimetres, totally different than, I don't want to confuse you with an Oregon. Now I'm just going to bring this in there. Look at that. That is touching the tooth perfect. That's set up really good. Sometimes you don't get it as good as that. You have to adjust the backstop to get it right, but that's actually quite good. It's, if anything, it's maybe slightly a little bit tight, but I did adjust it, so I have done an adjustment. Let's just turn around and back that off a little bit. Anyway, let's just do that. And we'll start like that and we'll grind that tooth. Now, I want to have a look at that tooth because I want to make sure that the depth is okay. And we'll have a look to make sure how good that ground. We'll zoom right in there so that you can see that. I just need to look. I think it could probably have a little bit more off it, so I probably could have left it as it was, but I wanted to be sure. So you're better off, yeah, just a little bit more, just one more grind, and that will be good to go to do all the right side. So it was set up correct. I just backed it off a little bit because I wanted to be sure. I'm just looking at that. Yeah, that's beautiful grind. I don't know whether you can see that one as well. Sometimes it's hard to focus. Beautiful, sharp corners. Look at them. So now that that's okay, I'd be quite happy in doing all of that right side and just continue doing the chain. After the chain's finished, you really need to check the rakers. And if you're going to check the rakers, my recommendation is not to use this type of gauge. This is not the type of raker gauge that I recommend to use. This is the Stihl constant gauge. It was invented by Joseph Cox back in the 50s and was superseded by Ray Carlton's Philo plate, which looks a little bit like this, and that's a progressive depth gauge, and that sits over an individual tooth. So I'll take this chain off after you do the chain. I'll take it off, put it back on a bar, and I will check each individual tooth and with a progressive depth gauge. Now, there is no reason why the left and the right, as you saw, when I turned this around to the right-hand side, it was fine. It wasn't grinding off any more than it should. So that proves that point. Now, the next point that I wanted to make was, this is a very El Cheapo grinder. About $60 here in Australia, whereas the USG is about $1,200. So this is very cheap grinder. But hey, it actually does work okay. You know, for what a lot of people say and how much negativity they put on them, again, it's blaming the tools and not the operator. I can sharpen a chain on this just as good as I can sharpen on any chainsaw grinder. This has a narrower wheel, so this is typically for 3/8 low profile rather than 3/8 standard. So you can get larger grinding wheels, but on this particular version, no, you can't get a fatter wheel. But I actually do have fatter wheels for the Azido. I did find a manufacturer that did actually make them. So I can grind 3/8 standard chain as well as 3/8 low profile as well as 0.325. Now, before I was talking about the backstop, and the backstop on these is as simple as what it is. It's a little bit loose. It's not as precision, but nonetheless, it sits right at the back. The same sort of thing. If you look at the drive link, it sits right down the bottom. And because it's cheap, it doesn't have any movement to the left and the right. I mean, what do you expect for $60? But you've got your clamp locking vise, that works okay, and your adjustment works okay, and you've also got your adjustment on the top. It spins at a fairly high RPM, and I've got no complaints using this. It's not as precision, but it still gives, to me, just as good a grind as a USG, provided you know what you're doing and you take your time. So there's nothing wrong with this, but it's not as good as a USG because it's not as versatile. You'll see these in a lot of stores. I'll rebadge them. They're made in China. What you will notice on here, this angle, that's your 60-degree angle that we spoke about before. It's fixed. It can't be adjusted. And this system here has a pin running through the head and the base plate. They're joined together by a pin. There's a slight bit of movement, but nothing to worry about. They're all like that. one thing that the USG has that no other grinders have is that they have this like an eye socket. So when you take this screw out, this screw has got a rounded end on it, and it goes into like an eye socket. It's like a little mini eye socket. And you've got that one on that side and you've got one on the other side over this side. And by loosening the nut and adjusting this inwards, you've got no movement of that arm whatsoever. That is as rigid as what you're ever going to get. And this is what makes a Stihl USG grinder a precision grinder, whereas the El Cheapos aren't. Now, before I spoke about the Oregon grinder, and I turned around and said that when you put a chain, I'll just take this chain off, and when you put a chain on an Oregon grinder, you feed from the opposite direction. And I said how the top plate setting was the opposite, and we'll just sort of go over that roughly. So again, I've got this stuck at 60 degrees. I virtually don't change my grinders off 60 degrees. Now, when we look at the top plate here, and if you looked at the Stihl USG grinder and we look at the back, do you notice that the left-hand tooth is now on the inside of the grinder, whereas on the USG, you feed it from the opposite direction. You feed the chain from this side, so the tooth's on the outside. So therefore, if we're going to do a left-hand tooth and we're going to grind that, we've got to turn it to 30 degrees to the right side. And if we're going to do a right-hand tooth, we have to turn it to the left side. So this is the opposite. Whereas on a USG grinder, and we'll go back there quickly, you've got to feed the chain back from this side. You see the difference? The head tilts that way. The head tilts that way. Everything's exactly the same except references. One tilts to the right, one tilts to the left. This is exactly the same, but it's the opposite because the chain comes in from the other direction on the USG. So when you say tilt, we're going to set this up for a left-hand tooth, you've got to tilt this to the right. And when you're going to do so it's the opposite, but it's actually perfect on a USG. Look, so I hope that's helped. We've just had a look on how to set this up and get the perfect grind. And don't worry about getting a caliper. You see people that get a digital caliper and they'll start to measure. They'll get their digital caliper and they'll start to measure the tooth. And they'll do what Stihl told them and find their shortest tooth, and then they start grinding off their largest tooth. I don't even worry about that. I just put the chain on, a brand new chain. I put a brand new chain on. Now, a little bit different for a used chain. If I look at a used chain, I'll try and find a tooth that looks fairly average in length. So I don't try and find my smallest tooth. I don't worry about my smallest tooth. I look for a tooth that looks like it's consistent with all the other teeth. That's going to be my master tooth, and that's the one I'll start on. If there's a few short teeth that don't get ground, I don't mind skipping one or two. So I won't even worry about grinding them because eventually what will happen, they'll catch up through subsequent grindings and they'll come in. So the odd tooth here or there is not going to make any difference to the cutting. Well, it may make some difference, but it's that small, it's not even worth worrying about. So yeah, the odd tooth I don't worry about. I hope that's been fairly comprehensive, especially about how to set that up. And I hope you can realise that between the left and the right, if you do have inconsistencies in saying that one tooth is, or one side's longer or shorter than the other, it's not the grinder, it's the operator. You've done something wrong. 9 times out of 10, it'll be the operator. It won't be the grinder. Even these El Cheapo grinders like this, I don't have any issues or any problems with them. I know a lot of people rubbish them. And yeah, look, I've got 2 grinders. Which one would I prefer to use? Yeah, of course, a Stihl USG grinder. What I use this little grinder for is for the little small chains, the 3/8 low profiles, And I just, look, it was on special. That's the reason I brought it today. It's just a cheap grinder. I'll get it anyway. And look, and it works fine. I've got no issues with it. Because I don't like swapping the wheel all the time. That's the other thing. When I put a wheel on a grinder, I like to use it. So this is for my 3/8 chain or 404 chain. Well, actually, sorry, a 404 needs to change the wheel. This grinder here is for my Hexa. It's set up as a hexagonal profile. I do have other grinders. I've got Tacoma grinders, and I've got another one of these grinders because it was on special as well. So it's just a spare grinder. I think I've got a total of about 8 or 9 grinders. So I've played around with them all, and I really don't have any complaints, but I see a lot of complaints. I even see people saying, oh, the scale's inaccurate. I've never found on any grinder to be any more than 1 or 2 degrees out. I will say that these cheap Chinese ones, these copies of the Oregon 511 were spot on. I found out that this grinder here was spot on, and I found out that the USG grinder was spot on without any problems whatsoever. Only one marking that was incorrect, and the placement of the mark on the back here, the reference mark, was out by 2.7 degrees. That's a well-known fact. I got a punch, and I punched a new mark, and I set the grinder up so it's perfectly now got the right reference mark. And what I mean by the reference mark, and if we zoom in, and I've checked this scale here. This scale here is absolutely spot on. But this is the reference mark here, and I found that on the back that reference mark wasn't exactly in the right spot. This scale here I have checked, and I found it to be absolutely spot on within a half a degree. So, yeah, who's going to argue about that? Anyway, look, it's been a long video. I really do hope that there's been some beneficial information that can help. So I guess we'll see in the comments and what people have got to say. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.